As you know, housing in this country is a very significant issue. There is not enough places for people to buy, there is not enough places for people to rent, and of course we have a system where we just bring on in hundreds of thousands of more people each and every year. The federal government thinks the way to solve all of this is, of course, to throw more money at the problem, but specifically not really homes that you and I would be able to get access to. Of course, it's generally speaking about social housing, housing commission homes. And the Prime Minister is not getting his way because the Greens are saying no. Everyone else in the Parliament is saying no. So today, Albo threw the ultimate toy out of the cot that any Australian Prime Minister has the opportunity to do, and that is to threaten that if they don't get what they want out of the Senate, and it is rejected twice, then we would be off to a double dissolution election. Try not to laugh.
You could go to a DD, though. But you probably won't go to a DD because it wouldn't be a great result for you, would it?
Well, we'll wait and see.
Now, of course, the bad result that Andrew was referring to there was that in a double dissolution election, it doesn't really matter what happens downstairs because it's still all of the normal seats. You need 76 to become the government. But in a double dissolution, what you do is rather than have half of the Senate up for grabs, with the other half sitting around for another 3 years, you wipe everyone and you go back to the start. Every spot in the Senate would become available. But as that other strategic political genius, the ghost, Malcolm Turnbull, worked out, if you have a double dissolution and all of the Senate is up for grabs, then the bar to actually get people elected to the Senate is halved. Literally half as many votes as you would need to get in on a half Senate or normal election would be the case in a double dissolution. Now, that would mean, given the current polls, there would be more Greens in the upper house. It would potentially mean that there would be more Libs in the upper house. Of course, the crossbench 2 would most likely explode, just like it did again when that guy playing 4D chess did it in 2016. And if you halved the quota for people to get into the Senate, there'd be more people from One Nation, more people from the Lambie Network, probably more people from United Australia Party, and definitely another Teal that would end up getting up, most likely in places like the ACT. But there's other people who would be added to the crossbench. Now, the Prime Minister thinks, look, more of the people who generally vote with me, who cares? The problem is it could go in any different direction. Legalised cannabis most likely would get pretty close to winning a Senate seat. Their vote is very close and they have representatives in the Victorian, New South Wales and Western Australian parliaments. What about the Libertarian movement? Libertarian movement, formerly of the Liberal Democrats, has had people elected to the parliament before. They do okay in Victoria, they're doing particularly well in New South Wales. Could they end up going in? And of course, when you have a look at the overall trajectory of the polls, the Prime Minister can threaten all he wants. Let's call his bluff. Because if there was an election, he would get his backside handed to him. He would lose majority. He would go into minority, as we showed you last week, or last night, I should say. There's some analysis that both parties could end up in the minority position. Don't forget, you want to talk about the polls, Prime Minister, before you put out your piss-weak threats? 57% of people have told the Redbridge polling organisation they cannot name one thing, not one thing, that you have done since you became Prime Minister to make people's life better. There is, of course, the polling that exists, as you've already just seen, from the Resolve people that show 53% of people say the current Prime Minister's performance in most recent weeks is poor or very poor. So good luck, pal. Make whatever threat you want, pour whatever sugar you need into the press gallery's ear that everything is just the same as it was before the 2022 election. Because just as it wasn't the same as the 2019 election, trying to turn the 2025 election into the 2016 election will have exactly the same result. A first-term government will get a whole collection of seats smashed out off their record. But unlike the ghost, who had a backbench thanks to the win of Tony Abbott in 2013, you don't have any backbench to burn. You have a majority government of just 2 seats. It is inevitable that every first-term government loses seats. We saw it in 2010 with Gillard and Rudd. We saw it in 1998 when it came to John Howard. We saw it in 2016 when it was the Ghost. So good luck. You make your threats. The Greens think they're in a sweet spot when it comes to housing, particularly in and around southeast Queensland, because their focus is utterly on renters. The opposition think that they're in a sweet spot because they believe that people should be able to access things like their superannuation to be able to get something resembling a deposit to be able to buy a house. And while there is tens of thousands of people who are waiting on public housing waiting lists, I'm not sure too many of them don't already vote for you, Prime Minister. And then there's, of course, two very different groups who would barely agree ever, who think the Prime Minister is the problem, who think that his government is the problem. And while he parties around thinking that he's the celebrity Prime Minister, the reality is that this is a guy who doesn't impress anyone. As you've heard tonight, chief executives via the Business Council of Australia, they're having a dinner. Right now the Prime Minister is copping it between the eyes from the business community. He also copped it between the eyes today from the man who led the ACTU when the Labor Party truly reformed the economy back in the 1980s and 1990s. Let's go back to what the bosses have had to say. Chief executives of the nation's biggest companies are warning that Australia is losing our way and taking steps backwards. The person who represents the Business Council, who represents companies like BHP, the banks, accounting firms, Wesfarmers, Hancock Prospecting, Telstra, Atlassian and Qantas, say the country is losing its way. Instead of taking big steps on the things that matter, we're taking incremental but noticeable steps backwards. Of course, the Prime Minister already had a response to these evil business leaders.
Is it really the time to be hitting businesses with your wave of IR reforms, increasing red tape and requirements on business?
Let's be very clear, those reforms have passed, and under those reforms, this Thursday, 2 days' time, the clock's ticking on whether we will reach 1 million new jobs being created since we were elected to government. So what we're seeing is more jobs being created. We are seeing higher wages, we're seeing continued growth, we're seeing a continued rise in business investment, we're seeing all of those factors.
Of course, as I've shown you many times before, when it comes to the economic growth, this country is more like the car that's out of tune, that's idling at the traffic lights and just slightly creeping forward. But then there's Bill Kelty, former boss of the ACTU, the trade union movement. He says that we need a Labor Party in which big issues are confronted, describing the Albanese government instead as mired in mediocrity. The government needs a greater dose of imagination. The Labor Party seems to have lost its way. So the bosses, the unions are saying the same thing. The Prime Minister just thinks you're stupid and are too busy to notice.
Well, I don't accept the premise because every indication is certainly not that. I'm very confident that when Australians focus on what the next term is about, a government that's making a difference to the economy, a government that wants an economy to work for people, not the other way around.
Blather. Of course, the reality, and this is what I've spoken about for years now, is that the economy that they talk about is the economy that the government's able to give itself a gold star for. The one that talks about, say, budget surpluses, not budget deficits. The economy, in terms of you and I, is that we're in recession. For 6 quarters in a row, the best part of 18 months, we've all gone backwards. The only reason that we are sputtering in terms of growth is because of the number of public servants that have been hired. The pay rises to the public servants. The amount of infrastructure spending that state governments are borrowing billions of dollars to build, which in part also is pushing up inflation. An inflation rate that, by the way, in Australia is doing worse than places like the United Kingdom, the United States or Canada. And when the Prime Minister talks about growth, again, stats, baby. We've got them here. We've got the data, not just the opinion, not just the Catherine Wheel of showbiz. We've got the data to prove it, pal. This is Australia. Anemic growth. Remember, as soon as there's a minus, as soon as you go under 0% for 2 quarters in a row, then you're in a recession. We are barely growing. Yet the Prime Minister says, well, look at us, 1.5% growth. We are doing better than insert country, insert country. Well, what about the United States? The United States, where inflation at one point hit the best part of 9%, it's the number one issue in the upcoming federal election, and if anything, would be the sole reason why there may be a change of president. Look at what their growth is compared to our growth right now. The Prime Minister likes to tell himself a whole collection of stories, that he has a special connection with the Australian politics that Peter Dutton could never possibly replicate. That if he tells you that he's helped you out with too little, too late tax cuts, you're too stupid to notice. That despite the fact that he promised to cut your energy bill by $275, instead, there's a $25 credit, maybe, for the next 12 months to get you through an election. But of course, that $25 credit comes after your bill's already gone up by the best part of $1,000. The Prime Minister and the people around him need to understand that in the same way, when you point to the stock market as an example of how amazing the economy is going, the reality of everyday people's lives is all that matters, because while the big companies may matter and the big unions may matter and the big media mates may matter, there's about 17 million Australians who once every couple of years get the chance to say whether they want to hire, rehire or fire a government. And the polls right now suggest that minority government is a virtual inevitability. You see, Anthony Albanese may well think, and the people around him, that if they just show lots of black and white images of Peter Dutton and say, cut, 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 and pretend that he wants to put a nuclear reactor in everyone's backyard, the reality is that when this government was hired, it was under a promise of doing better. Instead, everything got worse. There was 1 interest rate rise under the previous government. There have been 12 under this one. So you tell yourself your stories. The reporters will write them down and shove them through the air like you want them to. But the reality of the people sitting on the other end, they go, I'm sorry? Remember, almost 60% of Australians cannot say one thing that this government has done to make their lives any better. Good luck with that proposition at an election, Prime Minister.